All right, it's now time to put all of your knowledge that you've learned so far into practice. So in this lesson, you're going to be completing a number of challenges in order to create a contact list app. Now, as you can see from the preview, it's not looking quite right. So there's a couple of things that you have to do first in order to fix the CSS styles. This will involve going into the app.jsx and applying the necessary class names. Be sure to look through the styles.css file and looking at the class names that are available, and then you can compare your current app against the completed one at this address here. And through that comparison, hopefully you can figure out the right CSS styles to apply in order to get them to look the same. The next step is to extract the contact card as a reusable card component. The contact card currently lives inside the app.jsx file, and that's basically everything that's inside this card div. And once you've gotten it as a reusable card component, you're going to be using what you learned about props in order to render the default Beyonce card. So deleting all of these hard-coded bits of information and instead passing it over from the app.jsx as the properties to that custom card component. Finally, you're going to use the contacts.js file that we've got here, which has all of these details pre-populated for you, including some images of these people that I found on Google. So feel free to switch it up with your own information if you wish, and by the end, you should have a contacts app that looks like this, with 3 cards, each with a different contact, but effectively repeating the same element, which we're going to create using React. Pause the video now, fork the sandbox, or download it as a zip file to use your local editor, and give this challenge a go now. All right, how did you get on? Let's walk through the solution together. The first step was to apply the CSS styles to the app.jsx component so it starts looking a bit more like this. As you can see, we've got a little way to go, and the first thing you'll notice is that the name of Beyonce looks very different, even in terms of color and also location. So let's take a look inside our CSS file to see if there's something that might help us with that. So you'll find a class called name, which changes the font size and changes the color and gives it some margin away from other components. So let's try applying this to our app.js, and we're going to add it as a class name to this h2. So it was called name. So there we go. It's now much bigger, it's a different color, and it's now no longer touching the edge of the card. The next thing we want to fix is probably this image, right? This is circular, it's got a nice border around it. The component that we'll probably want to add that class to is our image component here. And the class name we want to add is going to be something related to an image. So it could either be this one or it could be this one. But notice how this one is actually just targeting all the child images that are associated with a card class. So this is actually already applied by default because we have our card div that contains an image element, and so it's already getting those margins applied, which is why it's being positioned where it is. But this circle image, however, seems to change the border radius, making it round, which is 50%, adding a white border, etc. So that seems like the one that we should apply to this image element. So let's add a circle image, hit save and refresh. And now we've got this nice circular avatar image. The final thing we want to do is probably to update these 2 lines because as you can see over here, they have a different color and they're positioned a little bit differently. Again, let's go on our journey of discovery through our styles.css, and we've got this class called info, which changes the color and adds a little bit of margin. So that is probably what we want to add to these 2 paragraph elements. So I'm going to hold down Option and click on these 2 places, and let's add the class name of info. And once that refreshes, you will see that our card component now looks exactly the same as the completed version. So that's step 1 out of the way. Now, step 2 is to extract the contact card as a reusable card component. So this is what React is all about, extracting components and simplifying them into smaller and smaller blocks. Everything that's inside this div with a class name of card corresponds to the card that's being rendered. The only thing that's left is this parent div and the h1, which is our heading over here. So let's go ahead and extract this div, and let's create a new file inside our components folder, which I'll call card.jsx. Inside here, we'll have to do all the usual things. Create a new card component and return the thing that we copied over just now. And finally, let's go ahead and export this as the default export, and it was called card. So now let's hit save and go back into our app.js and import our card component from /card. And now we can add it in here as a custom React component with the Pascal casing and a self-closing tag. And we've now got our Beyonce tag back in here just as before. Now we're on to step 3, which is to use what we learned about props in order to render the default Beyonce contact card. And this will allow us to make our card component reusable, so it doesn't always create a Beyonce card. So I'm going to go ahead and review this card component, looking for the parts which are custom to each contact. For example, the name, or the image source, or the telephone number and email. And I'm going to create them as properties on my card component. So I'll have a name, and it's going to be equal to what we have here, which is Beyonce. So let's paste that in there. And then I'll probably have an image, which is going to be the image source that I've got over here. And then we've got a telephone number, which we'll just copy over. And finally, we've got an email. And remember that even though it seems like we're creating a new object, and it does function as if we're passing this object over to create this card component as the input, the syntax is more like the HTML attributes, where you have the key, $, and then a value. So let's copy over that last piece of information, and now we can delete all the parts of our card component which are custom to each contact. So this way, this card component can be completely reusable. But in order for it to actually work, instead of giving us lots of syntax errors, we will need to get hold of all of these inputs being sent over to our card component. And we, of course, do that through the input called props. Now, remember that you can name this whatever it is you want, and it will still work because it's just going to be assigned as if it was a variable to this object that it contains all of these properties. But by convention, in all of the React apps, you'll see that people use the word props. So the places where we want to use those props or properties is firstly the name of the contact. So that's going to be props.name. And you can refer back to over here where you created the card and passed over all of these properties if you forget what each of these names are. And you, of course, have to enclose these inside a set of curly braces so it actually recognizes this as JavaScript instead of you just trying to create an H2 that says props.name. So the next one is our image source. So this is going to be props.image. And then we've got our first info paragraph, and this is going to be props.telephone, and as well as props.email. Now we are entirely using our properties that are passed over, properties which can contain custom values for name, image, telephone, and email. And it just so happens that we are creating a Beyonce contact card from our app.js. That's step 3 out of the way. And the final step is to use this file contacts.js to create the card components instead of typing it out by hand. In order to save you time from finding image URLs and telephones and emails, whichever you want, and making up a telephone and email, we created this contacts.js file. Now, let's first take a look at the structure of this. Notice how it's inside a set of square brackets. So this is an array, and it's an array of JavaScript objects. Each of these objects have a number of properties such as name, image URL, phone, email, and these correspond to all the things that we need to fill each contact card. If we want to use this contacts constant inside our app.js, you might have remembered our previous lessons on importing and exporting. So let's go ahead and export our contacts constant as the default from this file. And inside our app.js, we can go ahead and import that constant contacts, and we can specify the location. So it was ... contacts. And now we actually have access to that contacts constant, and you can even log it if you want to. And you'll see it printed in here as an array with 3 objects, each with all of these properties. So now we can go ahead and use these contacts to create each of our cards. So the first one will be contacts at position 0 dot name, and of course this is JavaScript code, so it needs to go inside a set of curly braces. And we can do the same with the rest of our contacts. And then we can simply just copy these cards and change the index of the item that we want. And now if you take a look at our app, you'll see that we've got all of our contacts added in, each in their own individual little cards, and we've got all of the details filled in for each of the cards. Now we've saved ourselves a lot of effort by creating these custom components using React, but it does get a little bit tedious adding in contacts 0.name, contacts 0.image URL, and then going on through that array. Don't worry, we have lots of fancy ways of dealing with this, and you'll be discovering that in the coming lessons where we learn about map, filter, and reduce. But for now, I want you to be really comfortable with this idea of props and passing them over when you create your custom components, and then receiving them through the input called props and accessing each of those properties inside in order to render a completely customized version of your component. In the next lesson, we're going to be looking at some React development tools that will help you see the structure of your app a little bit better, as well as being able to see the current values of each of these properties. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.